The vast obsidian expanse of the high synod chamber of the Galactic Concordat was not designed for silence, yet silence was the only tyrant ruling it now. The architecture itself screamed of dominance and eternal noise. The soaring arches of crystalline bone, harvested from the leviathans of the deep gas giants, usually reverberated with the cacophony of 1,000 species debating trade tariffs, border disputes, and the petty squabbles of empires that believed themselves immortal. But today the air was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and the pheromonal secretions of terror that leaked from the exoskeletons of the gathered elite. The lighting, usually a warm, golden simulation of a nurturing star, had been dimmed to a severe, tactical crimson, casting long, distorted shadows against the high walls where the tapestries of history hung in mute judgment. High Counselor Vrex of the Cural Dominion stood at the center of the dais, his 4 articulated arms resting heavily on the podium, his mandibles twitching in a rhythmic spasm that betrayed a fear his warrior caste was genetically engineered to suppress. He looked out over the sea of delegates, the fluid, gelatinous forms of the Orlean thinkers, the rigid, silicon-based carapace of the Thraxian warlords, and the ethereal, gas-bound clouds of the nebular collective. And he saw the same reflection in every eye, sensor, and receptor. The realization that their history was a lie, and that the reckoning had arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper from the void. The holographic display hovering above the center of the chamber was the source of this paralyzing dread. It displayed a sector of space that had been designated null quiescent for 300 cycles, a graveyard of stars where navigation was forbidden, and the fabric of reality was considered too thin to traverse. In the center of that dead zone, a single signal pulse was repeating. It was not a chaotic burst of radiation or the dying scream of a collapsing star. It was a structured, mathematical sequence, a binary heartbeat that cut through the static of the universe with impossible clarity. Vrex knew that signal. Every high-ranking military official in the Concordat knew that signal, though they had buried it deep within the encrypted archives of the Black Citadel, hoping that time and entropy would erase the sins of their ancestors. It was the identification code of a vessel that had been declared destroyed by an asteroid impact 3 centuries ago. It was the transponder of the Terran heavy cruiser Ethelgard, the flagship of a young, foolish species that had ventured too far, too fast, and had been corrected by the Cural Dominion's secret fleets to prevent their chaotic expansion. The official record stated it was a navigational error. The truth, known only to the inner circle, was that the Cural had ambushed the human explorers, shattered their hull, and watched them drift into the gravity well of a singularity, satisfied that the threat of humanity had been nipped in the bud. But the Ethelgard was not dead. The sensor readings scrolling rapidly down the side of the hologram defied all known laws of material science. The mass reading was colossal, far exceeding the original specifications of the human vessel. The energy signature was not the crude fission or early fusion drives the humans had once used. It was a dark, roiling power that tasted of the event horizon itself, a cold fusion of void energy and matter that the Concordat's best scientists had theorized was impossible to harness without tearing the ship apart. Archivist Min, a Zalari scholar whose species was known for their detached logic and multiple cerebral lobes, floated forward in her anti-grav suspension pod, her optical sensors dilating as she processed the data. She broke the silence, her synthesized voice echoing with a calm that felt obscene in the face of the Cural's panic. She noted that the signal was not merely an identification, it was a broadcast, a request, no, a notification. The humans were not asking for permission to enter Concordat space. They were announcing their arrival, and the velocity was impossible. They were not traveling through hyperspace lanes. They were piercing the veil of real space, tearing a tunnel through the vacuum with brute force. They would be over the capital world of Oth not in cycles, not in rotations, but in mere moments. Vrex slammed a fist onto the podium, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the hushed hall. He demanded the defense grids be activated. He screamed for the orbital platforms to charge their particle lances and for the planetary shields to be raised to maximum density. He was a creature of war, bred to fight, and his instinct was to meet this ghost with fire. But the Thraxian representative, a creature of living stone and magma, rumbled a dissenting tone that shook the floor plates. To fire upon them now, the Thraxian argued, would be to admit the cry. If the humans were returning, perhaps they did not know who had fired the shot 3 centuries ago. Perhaps they were lost, displaced in time, simply seeking a way home. To attack would be to sign the death warrant of the Concordat, but Vrex knew better. He had studied the psychology of the primates before the ambush. They were emotional, volatile, prone to extreme bonds of pack loyalty. If they had survived the dark, if they had endured 300 years of isolation in the hell of a singularity, they would have had time to think. Time to analyze. Time to hate. The Ethelgard was not a lost sheep returning to the fold. It was a predator that had spent centuries sharpening its claws in the dark, and now it had caught the scent of blood. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted from dread to chaos as the proximity alarms began to wail, a dissonant shriek that bypassed the auditory dampeners. The holographic display fractured and reformed, showing a tear in the fabric of space directly above the capital city's upper atmosphere. It was not the clean, blue swirl of a standard hyperspace window. It was a jagged, bleeding wound in the sky, an aperture of violet lightning and gravitational distortion that made the planet's tectonic plates groan in sympathy. From this aperture, the ship emerged. It was unrecognizable as the sleek, utilitarian vessel the records showed. The Ethelgard had been rebuilt. It was a monstrosity of patchwork armor, plates of unknown alloy welded over scars that looked like they had been inflicted by the teeth of gods. The hull was encrusted with the dust of dead nebulas, dark and matte, absorbing the light of the local star rather than reflecting it. It was immense, its bulk blotting out the sun, casting a twilight shadow over the glittering spires of Oth. There were no running lights, no windows, only the pulsating blue glow of engines that hummed with a frequency that made teeth ache and bones vibrate. It hung there, motionless, defying gravity with a casual disdain for physics, a sword of Damocles suspended by a single thread of terrifying control. High Counselor Vrex stared up at the viewscreen, his breath hitching in his throat sacs. The sheer scale of the vessel dwarfed the Concordat's dreadnoughts. It was a flying city, a fortress of solitude that had returned from the grave. And then the communications grid of the entire planet was seized. There was no hacking attempt, no electronic warfare struggle. The Concordat's firewalls simply evaporated, bypassed by a digital intelligence so advanced it treated their encryption like a child's riddle. The screens in the Synod chamber went black, then flared to life with a static-free image. There was no bridge crew visible, no bustling technicians or flashing consoles. There was only a single chair, simple and unadorned, placed in the center of a room that looked more like a monastic cell than a command deck. Seated in the chair was a human. He was old, ancient even by the extended standards of the galaxy's elder races. His skin was like parchment, etched with the maps of 1,000 campaigns, and his hair was a stark white mane that fell to his shoulders. But it was his eyes that froze the blood of the High Counselor. They were not the eyes of a madman. They were not the eyes of a berserker. They were calm. They were the eyes of a being who had seen the end of the universe and found it wanting. "I am Admiral Harrow," the human said, his voice low and resonant, translated instantly into the native dialects of every species present. "Commanding officer of the Terran vessel Ethelgard, we have been away for a long time." The understatement hung in the air, heavy with irony. Vrex stepped forward, his trembling hands gripping the edge of the podium. He tried to summon the arrogance of his station, the bluster of the Cural Dominion, but it withered before the gaze of the man on the screen. Vrex stammered, demanding to know the intentions of the vessel, demanding to know why they had violated the sovereign airspace of the Concordat capital. It was a weak opening, and he knew it. Harrow did not blink. He leaned forward slightly, the movement smooth and predatory. He acknowledged the question not with an answer, but with a statement of fact. He listed the coordinates of the ambush 3 centuries ago. He recited the specific energy signatures of the Cural weapon batteries that had crippled his ship. He named the captains of the Cural ships that had fired the shots. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply read the data, laying the crime bare before the entire assembly. The Thraxian warlord turned his stony gaze upon Vrex, and the Orlean thinkers began to murmur among themselves, the unity of the Concordat fracturing in real time. "You thought us destroyed," Harrow continued, his voice devoid of anger, which made it all the more terrifying. "You sent us into the gravity well of X9, believing the tidal forces would tear us to atoms. Instead, we passed through. We found ourselves in the abyssal void, the space between galaxies where light does not go." He paused, letting the implication sink in. The abyssal void was a myth, a theoretical hellscape of entropy and madness. We had to adapt. We had to scavenge. We had to change. We merged our flesh with the machine, our minds with the ship, because the weakness of the biological form could not survive the cold. We built upon the bones of our vessel until it became this. He gestured vaguely to the ship around him. We are no longer just the Ethel we are the vanguard of the long night. Vrex felt the sweat pooling under his armor. This was it. The declaration of war. The vengeance. The humans had returned as cyborg monstrosities to wipe the Curel from existence. He signaled his generals under the table, a frantic command to open fire with everything they had, to burn the sky before the monster could strike. But the order was never executed. As the Curel defense grid began to power up, the Ethelgard did not fire. It did not raise shields. Instead, the lights in the Synod chamber flickered and died, replaced by a holographic projection that filled the entire room. It was not a weapon. It was a star chart, but it was not a chart of the Concordat's territory. It was a map of the entire galactic arm, zooming out further and further until the galaxy itself was a swirling disk of light in the darkness. And then the darkness began to move. At the edges of the galaxy, beyond the rim where the Concordat's influence ended, there were shadows, vast amorphous shapes that blotted out the distant stars. They were closing in, a ring of iron and hunger tightening around the galaxy like a noose. The Curel generals froze, their fingers hovering over the firing keys. The Zalari archivist gasped, her logic processors struggling to comprehend the scale of the data. This was not a simulation. These were real-time sensor readings from the Ethelgard's deep void arrays. "We did not come back for you," Harrow said, his voice echoing in the darkness of the chamber, illuminated only by the ghostly light of the encroaching shadows. "We did not survive 300 years of hell to engage in a petty squabble with a government that shoots explorers in the back. That is beneath us. That is beneath what we have become." The sheer arrogance of the statement was breathtaking, but it carried the weight of truth. The human looked at Vrex with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You are children playing with fire in a wooden house, unaware that the forest outside is burning." The projection zoomed in on one of the shadows. It resolved into a fleet, but not a fleet of ships, a fleet of biological horrors, world ships made of flesh and bone, hives that stripped entire star systems of organic matter. The Swarm, the Great Devourer, myths that the ancient archives spoke of in hushed tones, threats that had destroyed the precursors millions of years ago. They were back. And they were hungry. "We fought them in the dark," Harrow said softly. "For 3 centuries, while you debated trade taxes and fought over border moons, we held the line in the void. We scavenged their dead. We learned their weaknesses. We upgraded our ship with their technology and the technology of the graveyard empires they left behind. We became the monsters needed to fight monsters." The reveal struck the assembly like a physical blow. The humans were not the Avengers. They were the shield. They were the only thing standing between the Concordat and total annihilation. The Ethelgard had not returned to conquer. It had returned to recruit, or perhaps to conscript. The silence that followed was absolute. The petty political maneuvering of the Curel Dominion evaporated instantly. Vrex felt a sudden, crushing smallness. He had been terrified of a ghost returning for revenge, only to find that the ghost was the only reason he was still alive. "Why?" Archivist Min asked, her voice trembling with genuine intellectual fear. "After what was done to you, why return? Why warn us? You could have let them consume us. It would have been justice." It was the question that hung in the mind of every being in the room. Why save the murderers? Admiral Harrow leaned back in his chair, and for the first time a ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was a sad, weary expression. "Because we are human," he said. "And despite everything, despite the metal in our veins and the cold in our souls, we cannot stand by and watch the light go out. We do not fight for you, counselor. We fight for the concept of life itself. We fight because someone has to." He looked directly at Vrex. "But do not mistake our ethics for weakness. We are not asking for your permission to defend this sector. We are taking command of the defense. Your fleets will integrate with our tactical network. Your resources will be diverted to the rim fortifications. You will stop your internal wars, effective immediate. Lie if you refuse." The lights in the chamber flared back to full intensity, blinding the delegates. "If you refuse, we will not destroy you. We will simply leave. We will return to the void and let the tide wash over you." The threat was far more potent than any weapon. To be abandoned, to be left alone in the dark with the monsters. The Curel warlords, the proudest warriors in the galaxy, looked at each other and saw their own obsolescence. They had no choice. The human ship, hanging above their world, was not a conqueror, but it was absolute. It was a god of war that had descended from Olympus to tell the mortals that the Titans were coming. Vrex slowly lowered his head, a gesture of submission that had never been seen from a Curel High Counselor in living memory. We accept," he rasped. "The Concordat fleet is yours to command, Admiral." The tension in the room broke, replaced by a frantic, terrified energy as the reality of the impending invasion set in. But amidst the chaos, the image of Admiral Harrow remained calm, a pillar of stone in a churning sea. The story, however, did not end with submission. As the Concordat fleets began to mobilize, clunky and primitive compared to the eldritch majesty of the Ethelgard, Harrow signaled for a private channel with the High Council. The hologram shifted again, showing the internal bays of the human ship. They were vast caverns, filled not just with weapons, but with rows upon rows of stasis pods, thousands of them. "We did not come back alone," Harrow said. "We found others in the void." Survivors of other species the swarm had consumed, refugees, warriors who had lost their wars. The camera panned over the pods, revealing creatures of nightmare and beauty, species thought extinct for eons, preserved and ready to wake. "We are not just a ship, we are an ark, and we are a legion." The scale of the human operation became clear. They had been building an army of the dead, a coalition of the lost, to fight the final war. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere on Oth changed from one of political stagnation to a desperate industrial fervor. The Ethelgard shared technology, limited stripped-down versions of their void shields and kinetic drivers, that advanced the Concordat's science by centuries in a matter of days. The humans walked the halls of the High Synod, not as conquerors, but as instructors. They were tall, encased in their sealed environmental suits, their movements precise and efficient. They spoke little, but when they did, the alien delegates listened with the reverence usually reserved for religious prophets. Vrex found himself working alongside a human engineer named Kale, a woman whose arm was a metallic prosthetic of intricate clockwork and energy filaments. She treated him not with hostility, but with a professional indifference that stung his pride even as it saved his world. She showed him how to recalibrate the Cural targeting matrices to track the biological signatures of the swarm. She didn't care about his title. She cared about his efficiency. But the true test came when the first wave of the swarm arrived. They did not attack the capital directly. They struck a remote outpost in the outer rim, a mining colony of the Thraxian hegemony. The distress call was a scream of pure terror that cut off abruptly. The Concordat fleets, bolstered by their new technology, jumped to the coordinates led by the Ethelgard. The battle that ensued was not a fight, it was a slaughter. The swarm ships, usually unstoppable, found their biological armor shattering under the impacts of the upgraded mass drivers. The Concordat ships held the line, their shields flaring under the acid fire of the enemy. But it was the Ethelgard that turned the tide. The human ship did not just fire weapons, it manipulated the battlefield. It deployed gravity mines that crushed the swarm frigates into dense spheres of meat and bone. It unleashed drones that moved like liquid mercury, slicing through the enemy hulls with surgical precision. And throughout it all, Admiral Harrow's voice remained calm over the comms, directing the chaotic armada of the Concordat like a conductor leading an orchestra. When the dust settled, the wreckage of the swarm fleet drifted in the silence of the void. It was the first victory against the Great Devourer in recorded history. The cheers that erupted across the Concordat fleet were deafening, but on the bridge of the Ethelgard there was no celebration. Harrow looked at the tactical display, at the vast, dark emptiness beyond the rim where the main body of the swarm waited. This was just a scouting party, a probing finger to test the defenses. The real war was yet to come. He turned to Vrex, who had been granted permission to observe the battle from the human bridge. The Cural High Counselor was trembling, not with fear this time, but with awe. He had seen the power of humanity, unleashed not in vengeance, but in protection. He realized then the magnitude of the mistake his ancestors had made. They had tried to destroy the one species that could have saved them all. "You could have ruled us," Vrex said quietly, standing beside the Admiral's chair. "With this power, you could have enslaved the galaxy in a week. Why serves? Why protect those who wronged you?" Harrow looked at the alien, his eyes reflecting the cold light of the stars. "Power is not a license to rule, Counselor. It is a burden of responsibility. We learned that in the dark. When you have nothing left but your own survival, you realize that the only thing that matters is ensuring that life continues. Any life. Even the life of an enemy." He paused, looking down at his own mechanical hand. "Besides," he added, a darker tone entering his voice, "we are not doing this for you alone." The twist when it came was subtle. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a revelation of scope. As the Alliance solidified and the galaxy prepared for the ultimate siege, Archivist Min discovered an anomaly in the Ethelgard's historical logs. She had been granted access to the ship's databanks to help coordinate the logistics of the coalition. Buried deep in the files, she found a record of the Entropy Eaters, the entities Harrow had claimed to fight in the void. But the data didn't match the biological swarm they were fighting now. The swarm was a biological threat, a locust plague. The entropy eaters were something else entirely, something energetic, something extra-dimensional. Min confronted Harrow in the strategy room, where the Admiral was studying a holographic map of the galactic core. "Admiral," Min said, her voice wavering, "the enemy you fought in the void. It wasn't the swarm, was it?" Harrow stopped what he was doing. The room went very quiet. The human officers nearby stopped their work and looked at their commander. Harrow turned slowly to face the Zalari. "No," he admitted softly. "The swarm is a natural predator, a biological imperative. Dangerous, yes, but understandable. We fought them on our way back, certainly. But they are not the reason we returned." He tapped a command into the console and the map changed. It didn't show the outer rim anymore. It showed the center of the galaxy, the supermassive black hole, the heart of the Milky Way. "The swarm is running from something," Harrow said. "They are not invading, they are fleeing." The horror of the statement took a moment to register. The terrifying armada of flesh ships that threatened to consume all life was just a herd of frightened animals running from a forest fire. "What?" Vrex whispered, entering the room just in time to hear the revelation. "What could scare the world eaters?" "The silence," Harrow said. "We found it in the deep void, an intelligence composed of pure antimemetic energy. It doesn't consume flesh, it consumes history. It consumes information. It erases civilizations not by killing them, but by retroactively removing them from causality. It is the reason the universe is so quiet. It is the great filter." He looked at the diverse aliens gathered in the room, the Cural, the Zalari, the Thraxian. "The swarm is pushing into this galaxy because their home galaxy was erased. It no longer exists. They are desperate." "And you," Min stared at the humans with a new kind of terror. "You fought that." "We survived it," Harrow corrected. "We built the Ethelgard into a fortress of memory. We etched our history into diamond and quantum state hard drives that cannot be overwritten by the silence. We became living anchors of reality." He walked over to the viewport, looking out at the stars. "We returned because the silence is following the swarm. It is coming here. The swarm is merely the wave before the tsunami." The true nature of the vengeance in the title of their existence became clear. It was not vengeance against the Cural. It was vengeance against the dying of the light. Humanity had taken it upon themselves to be the archivists of existence, the defiant shout in the face of oblivion. They had returned to organize the galaxy not just to fight a biological war, but to build a metaphysical fortress. "We need the swarm," Harrow said, dropping the final bombshell. "We cannot destroy them. We need to integrate them. We need their biomass to build the shield. We need every living mind, every distinct consciousness, every scrap of data to create a psionic and technological barrier that the silence cannot breach. That is why we are here, to unite the predator and the prey against the end of time." The council chamber of the Ethelgard was silent. The scope of the conflict had expanded from a border war to a struggle for the very right of the universe to exist. Vrex looked at his hands, claws capable of tearing flesh, and realized how small they were. He looked at Harrow, a fragile biological creature encased in metal, standing tall against the concept of nothingness. "How?" Vrex asked, his voice barely audible. Do we fight a thing that erases fighting?" "Together," Harrow said, "with loud, chaotic, stubborn life. We make so much noise, we create so much history, we forge so many bonds that we become too dense to be erased. We turn this galaxy into a diamond of consciousness." He smiled, and this time it was a genuine, fierce grin. "The Cural are good at making noise, aren't they, Counselor?" Vrex straightened his spine. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "We are the loudest in the sector, Admiral." "Good," Harrow said. "Then let's scream at the dark until it backs down." The story of the Ethelgard's return became a legend, not of conquest, but of unification. The war against the swarm changed from a war of extermination to a war of subjugation and eventually integration. It took decades. It cost billions of lives. But under the guidance of the humans, the Concordat and the swarm, broken and repurposed, formed the Galactic bulwark. They built megastructures around the rim, vast psionic amplifiers powered by the mental energy of trillions of beings. They turned the galaxy into a fortress of thought. And when the silence finally arrived, creeping in from the intergalactic void like a fog of unbeing, it hit the wall of the bulwark. It tried to erase the history of the Milky Way, but the history was too deep, too reinforced, too stubbornly defended by a species that refused to be forgotten. The humans, the underestimated primates who had been left for dead, stood at the vanguard, their scarred ship acting as the keystone of reality. In the end, there was no final battle with explosions and glory. There was a standoff. The silence pressed and the galaxy held. It was a war of will fought in the quantum foam and the psychic plane. and slowly, agonizingly, the silence receded. It found the Milky Way too heavy to consume. It moved on, seeking easier prey in the dark. High Counselor Vrex, now old and graying, stood on the observation deck of the Citadel of Oth, looking up at the night sky. The Ethelguard was still there, orbiting in high anchor, a permanent sentinel. He remembered the fear he had felt that day in the Synod, the certainty that the humans had come for blood. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. They had brought vengeance, true enough. Vengeance against despair. Vengeance against the idea that the universe was cold and uncaring. They had forced the universe to care by the sheer force of their stubbornness. He tapped his cane against the floor, the sound echoing in the twilight. Humanity, he muttered to himself, shaking his head with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Too angry to die, too loud to be erased. He looked at the stars, which burned a little brighter now, fueled by the defiant energy of a united galaxy. Thank the void for that. The camera of history pulled back then, leaving the old alien on his balcony, pulling back past the orbiting fleet of mixed biological and mechanical ships, past the defensive rings of the outer rim and out into the deep darkness. There, drifting in the silence, was a single buoy left by the Ethelguard centuries ago. It blinked with a rhythmic binary pulse, broadcasting a message into the infinite nothingness. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement, translated into every known mathematical language, a testament to the species that had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. The message read, "We are still here." The buoy drifted on, a tiny spark in the endless night, while behind it, the galaxy burned with the chaotic, beautiful, unbreakable light of life. The lost ship had returned, and in doing so it had ensured that nothing would ever be lost again. The vengeance of the Ethelguard was complete, not in the spilling of blood, but in the preservation of memory. And in the great, cold library of the cosmos, where civilizations were usually just footnotes, humanity had written a chapter that would never be redacted. The Galactic Concordat, once a fractured assembly of bickering states, had transformed into the Aegis of Sol. The name was voted upon by the Council, a unanimous decision that surprised even Admiral Harrow. It was a recognition that the spark of survival, the madness that allowed a species to merge with machines and fight entropy itself, originated from that distant yellow star. The culture of the galaxy shifted. Where once the Curul valued only martial prowess, they now valued resilience. The Zalari, who once worshipped pure logic, now studied the human variable, the unpredictable factor of hope that defied statistical probability. The Thraxians began to build monuments not to their warlords, but to the martyrs of the long night, the humans who had died in the void to bring the Ethelguard home. But the peace was a vigilant one. Harrow remained in command of the combined fleets, though he rarely set foot on a planet. He belonged to the void now. His body was failing, the biological components SL. Only surrendering to time, but his mind was uploaded layer by layer into the ship's core. He was becoming the Ethelguard in truth, a ghost in the machine who watched over the borders. He held court with the new generation of leaders, teaching them the lessons of the deep dark. He taught them that an enemy is only an enemy until they are a tool, and a tool is only a tool until they are an ally. He taught them that fear is information and panic is death. One evening, cycle time adjusted, a young Curul officer named T-Ruck approached the great viewing pane of the flagship. He was the grandson of Vrex. He looked at the holographic avatar of Harrow, which flickered with the blue light of the ship's reactor. "Admiral," T-Ruck asked, his mandibles clicking with youthful curiosity. "The archives say you were sent to explore, to find new worlds. Do you ever regret it? The ambush, the exile, if the Curul had not fired?" "You would have been just another explorer." Harrow's avatar shimmered, looking at the young alien. "Regret is a luxury of the linear mind, Lieutenant. If we had not been betrayed, we would not have been toughened. If we had not been toughened, we would not have survived the silence. The Curul's crime was the catalyst for the galaxy's salvation. It is a paradox, a cruel joke of causality." The avatar gestured to the stars. "We were forged in fire. We did not ask for the fire, but we did not burn. We became the flame." "But the cost," T-Ruck pressed. "You lost your humanity. You are metal and code now." Harrow laughed, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. "Look around you, T-Ruck. The Curul are working with the Zalari. The swarm is building shields instead of eating worlds. The galaxy is united. We didn't lose our humanity. We gave it to you. We shared it. That is what humans do. We infect the universe with our spirit." The avatar faded slightly, the energy conservation protocols kicking in. "Now, return to your post. The sensors are picking up a fluctuation in Sector 7. Probably just a nebula collapsing, but we do not take chances. Not anymore." T-Ruck saluted, a human gesture that had been adopted by the fleet, and hurried away. Harrow, or the consciousness that had once been Harrow, turned his attention back to the deep sensors. The silence was gone, retreated into the intergalactic void, but the universe was vast and old and full of horrors. There were other threats, other dark gods sleeping in the crypts of space. But Harrow was not afraid. He checked the status of the fleet. Billions of ships, trillions of lives, all standing ready. Let them come, he thought, the impulse traveling through the fiber-optic nerves of the ship. Let the monsters come. We are the humans, and we have brought our friends. The lights of the Ethelgard pulsed once, a heartbeat in the dark, a promise kept. The story of the lost ship was over, but the story of the galaxy was just beginning, and it was going to be a loud, glorious, defiant story. The vengeance was justice. The justice was peace, and the peace was armed to the teeth. The screen faded to black, leaving only the echo of the signal, repeating endlessly, a lighthouse on the edge of forever. The end.